Welcome back to Coffee and Conversation, a production of Empower Mississippi, where we're working to remove barriers to opportunity so all Mississippians can flourish. I'm Grant Callen, founder and president, and I'm delighted to be joined today by my friend, Dr. Lindsey Burke, who is the director of the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Dr. Burke is an ally in the school choice movement. I have been an admirer of her work for a long time, and I'm delighted to have her on the show. Welcome, Dr. Burke.
Well, thank you, Grant. And the feeling is mutual. Really happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, we'll jump in like this. So parents across the country are responding to the pandemic in really unique ways. And one of the most interesting trends that we've been following is the increasingly popular phenomenon, pandemic pods. What are these pandemic pods?
I know it sounds kind of dystopian and a little bit scary, but it is actually a beautiful illustration of civil society in action, which as Americans is exactly what we would expect to see in response to a global pandemic. And they really are, they have this sort of Burkean feel of little platoons that he talked about. It's the way that we see civil society unfolding is just as Tocqueville said, civil society unfolds in America. So it really has been amazing to see, but we're seeing families band together. They're pooling together their resources. In some cases, they are co-quarantining groups of kids together in the neighborhood or in a social circle that they might run in. And then once they pool those resources, they are hiring teachers, they're hiring private tutors, and they're delivering lessons that way. So at a moment when district schools across the country have shut their doors, they are not open to the kids whose parents' taxpayer dollars fund those schools. Families have said, we're not going to wait around for government solutions. We're going to do this on our own, and we're going to ensure educational continuity for our children.
So do these end up looking more like private schools or homeschooling co-ops or somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, so I would say they're closer to homeschooling co-ops, and a couple of different types of pods have unfolded over the past 2 months or so. This is still a really new phenomenon that we're witnessing in real time develop. So in some instances, you'll see families, once they form a pod with other families, they'll set up their pod. I think National School Choice Week first called it this, but as a learning pod, where the learning pod complements what they are learning in their district school. So the kids might still be using whatever their district school or even private school, but whatever the district school's online curriculum is, as it is, if they're providing that. And then they'll go through that content, and then they will meet in the afternoons to walk through that content together, to supplement it with additional courses or tutoring if they need it. So that's sort of a learning pod model. Then you have families who have said, we're going to completely unenroll from the district system. We're going to do whatever we need to do in a state to become a homeschooler. Some states require that you register with the state as a homeschooler, others don't. But we're going to basically become homeschoolers, and we're going to use the pod model full time. That's the way we're going to provide instruction to our children for the foreseeable future. And so there's a distinction there between those two types of pods. I would say the bulk of pods right now look more like learning pods, where they're complementary to the district system. And then I would just add, there's a third that I just heard about this week, actually, where we now have what are being referred to as single subject pods. So these are pods where families might gather together in a home just around a single content area. So maybe there is a teacher who they've hired or a course just on history or just on Spanish, whatever it might be that a kid needs. And they're gathering together around that single subject. So those are the three types so far as we've seen them.
And are you finding that these are mostly families who are worried about the virus and putting their kids back in school with kids that may not be in a safe environment? Or is it the opposite? Is it families who really want to be open and they don't have an in-person option, and so this is an alternative?
Yeah, I think it's a little of both. And that's the beauty of this, is that these pod options have really met the needs of families across the country who are having different concerns or different needs for their kids. So the families who aren't ready yet to go to fully in-person instruction, this is an option for them. It's a small option. You're with a group of 4 to 10 to maybe 12 other students who have probably been co-quarantining together more or less. Or it's an option that's available, and this is probably the case for many, many families when their districts are just not reopening. And we know that that's the case still for most districts across the country. They have not fully reopened to in-person instruction.
So for families who may not be able to afford a full tuition or expensive private school, or their private school may not even be open, how are families affording to hire a teacher or a tutor to come on full time to help with this?
Well, I would say as quickly as the pod phenomenon sort of spread across the country, we saw these concerns, these equity concerns. What about children from low-income families or even middle-income families who might not be able to afford to pay into a pod to hire a teacher to come teach to that home, that pod? And this is why, more than ever, it is critical that states provide education savings accounts to families. That, I think, is the number one policy solution right now. And it's a policy solution that's in reach, right? I mean, we know that states are able to do this. We've seen ESAs across the states grow in number. We've got Arizona, Florida, Mississippi, Tennessee, North Carolina have all established to varying degrees education savings accounts where parents get a portion of what would have been spent on their child in that child's public school. And that money then can be used for a host of education-related services and products and providers, which, by the way, includes private tutors and teachers and online courses and special education services and therapies. And so I've been saying you could not have conceptualized a more perfect policy to meet the moment that we're in to finance pods. I mean, it's really incredible. They are the perfect policy pairing with pods, education savings accounts. And so we already know in states like Arizona, where ESAs are quite robust and quite a few families have access to them, that families are using their education savings accounts to pay for their pods. It's an amazing thing to think about. And it's just an amazing level of innovation that we've seen really adapt quickly in the face of this pandemic. So if we're worried about equity, and we should be when it comes to education financing, imagine if every child, particularly low-income students, were walking around with the money in their pocket that would have been spent on them in the public system. They would all be able to pay for education pods. And so that's the policy solution. It's there. It's within our grasp. We just need to move on it.
Well, as you know, Mississippi does have an ESA. It's been narrowly defined. It's limited to students with special needs. But this, we've been advocating for it to expand. And this pandemic is another reminder of why it's important that we expand it. In a lot of ways, this idea is kind of we're kind of going back to the one-room schoolhouse approach to some degree. And I wonder, in states like Mississippi, where we don't have an expansive ESA, is this just a cheaper model where it can be done a lot more cost effectively than building out an entire private school or charter school?
Yeah. And look, the data on how much it costs to pod, it's a wide range, right? We have heard $10 an hour for some families to amounts that are higher than that. And we have heard of pods that have opened and parents aren't even paying financially into those pods. Instead, they're providing their services. They might teach a class or open up their home to be used for the pod, or help make the pod lunches for the kids who are in that pod. And so we know that it can be incredibly affordable for families who are participating. But even if we're talking about a few $100s a month, which I'm a little hesitant to use average in this case with pods because it's still so new, but seems to be what we're hearing from a lot of families, that can be prohibitive. And so providing those families with ESAs, I think, is the best path forward that has been conceived to date. And it's something that states should do. They should do it on an emergency basis. They should have done it yesterday. But this is a targeted response to the pandemic and is good and I think necessary public policy right now, but is good public policy moving forward as well.
And do you have any sense for how widespread this is? I mean, we have a lot of anecdotal evidence that these things are happening in a number of states. How do we measure the proliferation of this?
Oh, I wish we had harder data on it just as a researcher to know exactly how many families are doing it. We don't know yet. I think 6 months from now, maybe a year from now, we'll be able to look back and have much better data on it. We know that school enrollment in district schools across the country is down significantly in a lot of districts. So that's one indicator. We know applications for school choice programs are up in a lot of areas. I know Arizona's education savings account applications have tripled since last year. So that's another good indication that families are doing something outside of the district model. We know homeschooling is up. And so I think a lot of that, of the new pod momentum, is captured in what we're seeing in those enrollment numbers, but we'll know more moving forward. I would say another good indicator, if you look at some of the social media outlets where families are exchanging information about how to form a pod, how to hire a teacher, how you should interview a teacher that you're going to hire. It's really interesting, right? Again, it goes back to the civil society exchange of information. If you look at the main Facebook group for pods, which only formed a few months ago, it is now well over 40,000 members on that Facebook page. And they have sub pages for every region across the country. So it really has, it's been organic with families coming together. And now, by the way, we're seeing a market response as well, where there are organizations and companies popping up to provide additional services to families, like academic transcripts for families who have their child in a pod.
Well, and you mentioned declining enrollment in traditional public school. And I think that is going to be one indicator of how large this is simply that traditional public schools in a lot of places are kind of screaming and hollering about this. I know Denver has urged their parents in the district not to participate. In places like Fairfax County, Virginia, they put out statements saying, please don't participate in these pods. Why do you think traditional public schools are against this?
Well, I would put it even more strongly than you just put it, which is that there are districts that are shaming parents for forming pods. And Denver is unfortunately a great example of that. Denver sent out a letter to families in the district, and they said, if you form a pod, you are, well, first of all, you should choose your district school first, it said. But then if you decide to form a pod, that you are complicit in exacerbating educational inequality. I mean, my goodness, what a thing to say to families who right now are just trying to do everything they can to provide the education to their children that they haven't had since March. We're talking about a long time now with months and months of learning loss. And so for the district to come out and say something like that to families, not only I think was inappropriate, but also was an indictment of the district. Jason Bedrick at EdChoice and I had a piece in NRO recently on this, that the district is effectively admitting, implicit in that argument, that the product the district is providing is inferior to the product that families are providing as part of pods. So just an interesting aside there. And you're right, we've seen it in places like Fairfax County, Virginia as well.
And do you think this is sort of universally public education is against this? Or do you think this might be a place where teachers see the benefit of this? Because I see some evidence that teachers are coming on or even leaving their district to go teach in these things. And it's a real opportunity for many of them.
It's a huge opportunity. And admittedly, what we know about the teacher side of it right now is anecdotal for the most part. But there was a great piece in the Washington Post about a month ago about a teacher in Broward County, Florida, who said she had a couple of families reach out to her to teach directly to their pod. And I think she ended up with 4 families total. She said she will be earning more teaching to those 4 families than she earned all year last year teaching at her prior private school. I mean, that's quite something. And I think it should make us all incredibly optimistic about what rethinking the shape and the delivery of education can mean for teachers as well. I think too often teachers are unconvinced, perhaps, of how school choice would benefit them in the long run. And look, we saw this in Sweden, right? Decades ago, when Sweden adopted school choice, teachers had concerns. But after a few years passed, they thought improved their standing and their professionalization as well. We'll see the same thing here. But I think the most exciting and immediate near-term prospect for teachers is that they could potentially earn much more than they do in the rigid existing district system, which pays them through step and pay increases rather than based on merit. If you're a teacher and a pod is attracting you, they are paying you based on merit. They are paying you because they want what you're able to bring to that pod. And that's a benefit to the teacher, to the student, to the family, to everybody involved.
So stepping back a little bit, this is a unique moment. Do you think this is a flash in the pan, or is this a fundamental change in the way we think about education in America?
That's the $64,000 question, right? Or maybe we should call it the $182,000 question, which is on average what we spend to get a child from kindergarten through high school graduation in the aggregate. I think that I don't want to overestimate what the long-term impact could be, but I do think there's going to be a long-term impact that is non-trivial. I think that we are going to see the number of families who say, you know what? This pod thing, this micro schooling, homeschooling co-op, whatever we want to call it, it's working for us. I have more time with my children. We can craft the school day the way we want it to be crafted. We can teach in a manner that is competency-based, where we know that our children are learning the content they should learn because we're not moving forward until we've mastered that content. And they have incredibly small class sizes, right? Which is something we hear about frequently. And so I think families are really going to enjoy this. They are enjoying it, and they're going to want it for the long term. One data point, we pre-pandemic know that there were about 1.6 million children across the country who were homeschooling. And that's about 3% of the overall K-12 school age population. So moving forward, even if just 6% of families continue to pod permanently, that means a doubling of the number of families who are homeschooling. And that's going to be a major shift in how we deliver education in this country. And I would also add, I think there's also just going to be a more profound shift in how we think about education and how we think about aligning the needs of children with the education that they're delivering. And that's a benefit, I think, for everybody, and will be a benefit long term.
But why has the system been so resistant to change? I mean, we've seen innovation change the landscape of technology and automation and so many other sectors. And education seems to be so slow to adapt. And parents seem to want something more. We're seeing, there's data that parents are at an all-time level of frustration with districts and the offerings of their neighborhood public schools. And to be fair, there's some great public schools, and there's certainly places where parents are really happy. But overall, parents are not growing in their satisfaction with traditional public education, and yet it's not adapting. Why is that?
Well, there are a lot of reasons. I would say the number one reason is because we have an education system in this country that is structured more like a monopoly than a free market provision of services and goods. And that's something that we set up over 100 years ago. The common school movements of the late 1800s, which were the proto-public schools of the day, they really ingrained this factory model of education that we saw develop throughout the early 20th century. And as that was developing, so did the special interest groups that maintain that system, which today, of course, we know as the modern day teachers unions, who do everything they can to block change. They see an escape hatch from the district system as an existential threat to the model that they have protected for so long. So that's the number one issue. It is a special interest group issue where you've got these special interests blocking reform. But I think even more fundamentally, it's that we have set up a system that looks more like a monopoly than the free market. And we assign kids through outdated, inequitable residential assignment policies to whatever government school is closest to where their family can afford to buy a home, regardless of whether that district school is the right fit for them. And we only give them an exit option if they can afford to pay twice in taxes, largely property taxes for their district school, and then again in the form of private school tuition. And very few families can do that, certainly not low-income families. So they have very few exit options. I think a lot of families don't feel that their voices are heard. It is, school board elections, right, are off cycle, often very difficult to move school boards in the right direction as well. So there are a lot of issues there, but fundamentally it is an issue of parents not having an exit because dollars do not follow the child in most cases.
So if you're a parent today listening to this conversation and you're frustrated with the options you have for your kids, what would the first couple of steps be if you wanted to start a pandemic pod?
Yeah. So we now have a great articulation of steps because of a wonderful mother out in Arizona by the name of Jenny Clark, who has actually been doing the pod thing. So we can't call it a pandemic pod, but she's been a part of a pod for 3 years now. She calls her pod Cottage Class, but has a few families in her pod. And she has written up really excellent ways to think about how to form your pod. And so what Jenny talks about is the first thing you need to do is you need to make a list. What is it that you need for your child? What subjects does he need this semester or school year? What do you hope to be able to provide in terms of academic content generally? So make that list, because that will help guide you as you seek out other families to form your pod. Are they looking for similar things? And then at that point, step 2, she says, is to think about what you can contribute to the pod. As I said earlier, it doesn't necessarily have to be financial. It is typical that families pay something into their pod in order to be able to hire that private teacher. But it could also be making your home available for families to meet in. It could be things like making lunches for the pod one day a week, or teaching something that you have content matter expertise into the pod. So think about what you can contribute. And then third, go on those social media sites. Go on Facebook. I know that might sound like a funny recommendation, but it really has become the home for where families exchange information and can at least identify where geographically in their neighborhood pods are forming. They can communicate with other families and other teachers as well. So those, I think, would be the top 3 steps. Make a list, think about what you can contribute, and then hop on social media and start networking with other families.
Well, that's a very practical approach, and that's going to be very helpful for many of our families that are listening. And I thank you for your time and your perspective on this, and really your leadership on this across the country. And I enjoyed the conversation.
I did too. Thank you for having me, Grant.